Hello and welcome to Mr. and Mrs. Social Studies. My name is Jake and I'm going to be going through with you my unit plans for my prehistory unit. If you're interested in anything that I'm doing or anything that I talk about here, you can find a link to the list of all the resources and websites where I made my resources from in the link down below. So let's go ahead and get started. So to kick off pretty much all of my units, especially being in an ancient world class, teaching 6th graders, I've learned through the years that they have no experience with this era in time. So even the most basic of vocabulary words, what it seems like to me, you definitely need to go over with them. So as unexciting as the first part sounds, I do have them do, I like to think of it like a scavenger hunt, but really it's just finding a bunch of words and writing down definitions in a piece of paper or on a Google Doc. But I have them go ahead and find prehistory vocabulary words out of the textbook that we use, which is the HMH series, the brand new Ancient Civilizations book they released this year. The online version is really cool because they can go ahead and find the words like in there, click on the word and find the definition. But it gives them the chance to go through, look through the textbook. I'm not really a big textbook guy because I think it's kind of dry and boring, but I know that for some students it's really helpful to have that as a resource and overview of what we're going to be going into. So I have them go ahead and do that. And then I have them do these interactive notebooks. They put the vocab list in their notebook. And while it may not seem very exciting up front, at least I think to the kids it might not, we go back and refer to that list for the different vocab words we talk about throughout the unit. So it's incredibly invaluable, and I think from the student perspective, it is nice to have that as a resource, as a go-to, as opposed to always having to go back and look at other notes. Also, we do in our school, based upon the new social studies standards in Illinois, or I guess this is like the 2nd or 3rd year of them, we do a essential question for each of our units. So for example, the essential question for our prehistory unit: how did humans' way of life change as they interacted with each other and as they adapted to new environments? So throughout the entire unit, we're constantly trying to bring back how we're answering that essential question with the different lessons that we talk about, whether it's with the hominids, the human migrations, the rise of agriculture, which we'll get all into in here. And then at the end of the unit, they're expected to go ahead and answer this question on their unit test. And they have to bring up different evidence or bring up different discussion points that we've constantly reiterated throughout the course of the unit. So that's something we go ahead and introduce at the beginning. I put that in their interactive notebook as well, or they do, and yeah, we constantly go back to that. So then the first thing that I go ahead and I go into, and this can be very tricky because just again, based I guess on my own previous experience, when you're getting into prehistory, you kind of are delving a little bit into the evolution discussion, I suppose, for lack of a better term. And I know in previous years I've gotten into, not like hot water, but I've had a few kids who have been, for lack of a better term, like turned off by discussion of that. So I think it's just really, it depends on your student population. Like this year, I just recently finished the unit and I didn't really have a problem. But in previous years, kind of just knowing your clientele, I always reiterate the fact that, because it's true, it's prehistory, and the idea is that everything that's happened here, it's before reading and writing, before there was a written record. So that it is a theory, however, I always base it in the evidence that we have, whether it's be the skulls of the different hominids and like, fossils that we found, or the remains of different cities that have been found, so on and so forth. So always base it in fact, but I reemphasize that it is a theory, and then it depends on your point of view. I don't specifically get into like the whole religious aspect. It's just one of those things, you don't talk about religion, politics, and the Great Pumpkin, right? Since it is close to Halloween time. But that can be something you may have to address depending on the population of your students and whatnot beginning of the unit. But I go ahead and have them do a jigsaw activity, and I got a lot of my information not only from the HMH textbook, as I mentioned, but especially from the there's a early Smithsonian like natural history site that they put up where it shows like a family tree of all these different hominids, and I just really emphasize like 4 major groups, like the Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Homo sapiens. Again, you kind of have to keep things as serious as you can, unfortunately, with just the way that the words sound. And I've had to get on a couple kids, kind of like nip it in the bud in private when they're like, oh, Homo, and they take it unfortunately into that direction. This can be a very awkward unit to teach if you haven't taught it before, but you just have to be serious about it and act like that there's nothing wrong with it, and the kids will buy into it. But we do this jigsaw activity where I have the Homo sapiens I leave out because that's pretty clear, like modern day. I have this classification chart I have them fill out, and the kids break up into 3 different groups, I guess, and you could have more than one group do each hominid depending on your class size. I usually have about like 2 groups, like read about Australopithecus, 2 read about Homo habilis, 2 read about Homo erectus. They have to record information such as the year span of when we believe that they lived, their technology, their diet, where is it that we believe that they live based on evidence from different fossils that we found, height size, brain size, teeth size. The whole point of it is not to be like specific about, oh, this is the exact brain size of Homo habilis, but to see the trends and the patterns of how hominids changed over time. And that's what we emphasize when they've completed the activity and they've learned about their hominid. They go and teach the other another group of people about their hominid, hence the whole jigsaw activity. It's just really good for them to see the trends on how exactly we became what we are and the different characteristics that we developed, the different like highlights, bipedalism, first showing up with Australopithecus for part of the time, and then getting into Homo habilis, making stone tools, Homo erectus, migrating outside of Africa to other parts of the world, and then Homo sapiens, us basically, doing the rest in not that long of a time compared to the other hominids. So that's what I go ahead and I do there. And then from that, we get into early human migration, which might be my favorite part of this unit. And there's a couple of videos from YouTube that I actually started using this year to emphasize the point. Because we talk about, well, what are the possible reasons that people migrated? Well, it was because food and water was limited, because the climate, a large part of the Stone Ages was within the last major ice age. And so obviously temperatures were freezing, but then we get into, well, why did they leave Africa in the first place? It couldn't have been freezing and glacial like there, right? That's near the equator. So we get into the whole ice age, dries up the planet. So drought originally motivated people to leave. And then they reach the cold temperatures, not knowing where they're going. Obviously, there's no human maps yet. It's prehistory. And so then they keep, kind of unintentionally migrating around the world, trying to find better conditions, better life, where there's enough food to hunt and gather. This, of course, is before farming. And so I showed them this video. One's from the Science Insider channel, and it shows the migration routes from Africa all the way to South America and spreading to all the continents minus Antarctica in between. And it's got this really dramatic classical music, which I'm into also just on the side, so that's always fun. And then a really cool video is from National History Institute. I might be misquoting there, but it's called Human Populations Through Time is the video, what it's called. And so it's really cool because it shows you from the beginning of, when we believe that we first migrated out of Africa. It then puts up this big map, and then it has this little population counter on the top. And so then it shows you from it starts this at year 1 common era, and it goes all the way even into projecting to 2100. And it shows these different yellow dots on the map spring up, where different populations are starting to grow throughout time, and it shows how populations increase. It even shows decreases when the Black Plague happened in the 1300s. So it gives, and it shows the different major events of world history shows up throughout the time. So farming, it shows how the population skyrockets when people are able to produce their own food. And then it shows how the population grows or decreases based on other events in world history. And it's really, the kids love it, especially the last 200 years, when the Industrial Revolution happens, and then we just go boom, 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 all this population growth happens in the last couple hundred years, where we go from 1 billion to the 7.34, I believe that we're at here today. And then how we're projected to reach 11 billion by the time that 2100, where hopefully these guys are still kicking it, as the senior citizens of our time. So just really cool for them to see how long it took for people to migrate and how long population took to grow and how quickly we're growing right now compared to pretty much the rest of our history, especially in early ancient times. And then I just give them a map. This came from a previous textbook that we used, and I don't typically like to use all the textbook resources, but it was a good map showing human migration, some questions, practicing map skills that we'd emphasized in a previous mini unit that we did on social studies skills. So just practicing knowing their continents, practicing using a scale to measure distance from point A to point B. How far did people travel from Africa to Asia, or how far did it take, or how long the Bering Strait was, and how they used that to migrate. We believe, that's one of the theories at least right now, from Asia over to the Americas. And then I also did a little bit, this is something that, trying to make a modern day connection. If you ever heard Paul Salopek and the Out of Eden walk through National Geographic, he is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who is currently in the midst of a 7-year long walk. I believe he is in year 5 right now. He has 2 more years to go, but he is going through a process of slow journalism where he is going along the paths of human migration, a modified path. But he's going along the path of human migration from Africa to the tip of South America, and he is interacting with the different populations that he is running into. He is recording and doing interviews and doing stories about them, working with them. So it's really, really cool. Unfortunately for us, for some reason, the website for the National Geographic walk didn't exactly load well, but that was, I think, more so just technology issues than anything. But I've got a link on our Google Classroom in case any of the kids are interested in seeing where's Paul now. So then, and this is something that I might change for next year. This is always a unit as far as structuring when you teach what, because it's also a lot of skills in addition to just the content. But at this point, after we get through the migrations and talking about, how many years ago these happened, how many years ago the hominids lived, I get into the whole time terminology. So like the BCE and CE, so before Common Era and Common Era versus BC and AD, before Christ, and then the Latin translation, Anno Domini, Year of the Lord. So basically teaching the kids how exactly the historical timeline works and how there's the 2 different systems. BC and AD are obviously religious based around the birth of Christ. BCE and CE are really the same thing, but instead they just call it the Common Era, so it's more accessible to everybody, even if you don't believe in Christianity. So we go ahead, we take a bunch of dates, we plot like a timeline, I compare it to like a number line in math, and we show them side by side. And it's one of the tougher, I think, lessons for the kids initially to get, but based on the results in their test, it looked like that it worked. So definitely spending time doing that, because that was something that I forgot about the first couple of years, is that this is probably the first time. I mean, the kids may have heard of like BC and AD, but they've never been expected to actually like keep track of time and dates with that. And I'm not really a big dates guy, like you have to know like the date that this and this happened. I mean, just a good way for them to be able to, like when they see these different dates, especially it's gonna hopefully pay dividends down the road when we get into our next several units where now information is being recorded. We do have more specific dates for a lot of these events, and that they'll be able to tell time. Because I know with the BCE, they get confused with, well, the bigger years actually mean that it was earlier in time. I thought that means that it's later. And so we get into that, how there's no year 0, and so then that's something that you have to address with how BCE, before a Common Era, is 1 BCE means 1 year before year 1 in the Common Era, so on and so forth. So we spend a day really focusing on that, half the class period, full class period. Definitely, that's one of those beyond just the prehistory things that definitely deserves a lot of attention. Because you're going to be, if you're teaching an ancient civilizations course, you're going to be spending a lot of time going between BCE and CE, which is really cool, but I prefer the more historical based ones, so I used a little bit of the earlier documentary that they created. So we do that, and I should have mentioned this, we also done the QFT before, so we use it with the image of the bones of Lucy, who was a Australopithecus that we discovered, or people discovered like 1974, and that's the introduction I used into that whole hominid jigsaw I was talking about. So the kids have already seen these QFTs for me a few times already, even going back to a previous skills unit that we used too. So they work through that pretty quickly and understand what the expectation is with that. And then after all that, I'm not doing this until my Mesopotamia unit, which we'll hear about later on in the year. So after doing the BCE CE stuff, I give them some guided notes on the Stone Age, and I have a Prezi that I go ahead and I use to show them that. There's also a link to that in the resources below. But basically, you could use it in one of 2 ways. I usually like to go through it with them, like notes, 'cause it's all filled out skeleton notes. They just have to fill in the remainders of the sentences. And we have discussions about what we bring up there as well. So we get into like the Paleolithic and Neolithic age, Old versus New Stone Age. We re-emphasize the importance of the Ice Age and impacting why people lived as nomads and hunting and gathering, and what exactly a nomad is. And then we get into how farming was so revolutionary with the agricultural revolution when you enter the new Stone Age, and why that is so significant. And domestication and all of that process, and how that also was a reason that people started to farm, right? The benefits of farming. and why people could, and then getting into, well, that results in a population spike, that results in people making permanent settlements, that results in people being able to start doing other jobs, the concept of jobs starting because we have a big enough food supply that can feed everybody, as opposed to everyone just going ahead and competing against one another for limited resources. Unfortunately, I don't remember off the top of my head. It's from a hands-on, like, ancient world history book. It's like teacher created resources. I don't remember the title of it, unfortunately, but they have a really cool survival simulation activity in there where the kids have to try to survive prehistoric times with a time limit. And so they have to go ahead and collect water from like a river, which is like a bucket that we set up like outside of the school, and they have to collect it by the spoonful, and they have to fill it to a certain point in the cup to meet their water requirement for surviving. So they kind of learn by that activity based upon like how far. I tell them which river you have to go to. I have one that's located relatively close to where their filling station is at, and then I have one that is located way farther away. And so they learn that based upon where you settle, you obviously want to settle closer to the river, closer to the water source, because it's a lot easier to get water and get more water in a shorter amount of time than if you're having to travel a longer way and having to carry that a longer way back to your home. We also we put the whole hunting and gathering, the nomad versus farming, which one is better to test. And so inside my classroom, I hide like a handful of food units. So like it says like deer, rabbit, and fish, and lizards. And like they're each worth like a certain amount of food units. They have to get a total of 20 in order to complete the food part of the activity for their survival. But there's only a limited number of these animals that are hidden around the room. Not everybody can find enough and live that way. And so what it results in, hopefully if the kids are thinking about it, they can do the other method of getting food, which is where they have to take, and it seems like they have to do more work, they have to open up the textbook, they have to answer some multiple choice questions regarding farming, some of which that we went over, some of which hadn't introduced yet. So they also had to practice searching with table of contents and the index to find their information. And if they successfully farm, which doesn't seem as fun, but it seems to take a longer amount of time, you get 20 food units. You automatically pass that part of the activity. And so most of the kids end up, we go over it at the end, most of them survived because they farmed. Maybe 2 were able to find like all of the animal resources around, and us were able to survive that way. Because people did obviously survive hunting and gathering, but it shows that farming is more effective. And then we also have them build like shelters, so I get out a bunch of construction papers and glue sticks and tape and other materials. I wouldn't go the popsicle stick route because that gets really messy and really nasty. And with the glue, I just try to keep it as, there is unfortunately a lot of recycling that happens afterward, but it's not as messy, it's easier to clean up. So they also have to build like a model shelter to complete the basic needs of trying to survive. So the kids really seem to enjoy that, and they're like rushing through trying to get this done in like 20 minutes, and then we make a big deal out of who survived and who didn't at the end. And then we debrief about with this little reflection activity the following day. So what did you learn from this? If you, for example, if I let you work together, because I have them do it all individually, do you think the rate of survival would have increased? Which people tended to have an easier time surviving, the nomads who were hunting and gathering, or the farmers? And so let me get into the significance of the agricultural revolution now with this firsthand experience they have. The next thing I did, and I kind of forgot to mention this earlier, so we also talk about like Utsi the Iceman, which if you don't know who he is the oldest known, at this point, making this in 2018, oldest known mummy that we've ever discovered, even older than any of the pharaohs or other mummies that we've discovered from the ancient Egyptians, dating to about, for Utsi, circa like 3000 BCE, give or take a few years. So what I like to do is I do this little question formulation technique activity, or it's known as the QFT. It comes from the Right Question Institute, and there's a link to their website down below. But the idea is that you put up in this case, an image I did of the Iceman himself and like where he was discovered by these 2 dudes in the early 90s who are really rocking awesome facial hair, by the way. We go ahead and we show that, and then I show them like different pictures of like different artifacts that were found with him, but I don't say like what they were. So like there's this image of like this backpack, but you can't really tell like what it is. It's just like two pieces of wood and then like something connecting them. And then I show like a picture of this axe that he had, this knife, and his shoes, which always fascinates the kids, that his shoes are, they're not like Air Jordans or anything, right? We go ahead, they ask as many questions as they can about the images they've seen, And then we discuss and we share the questions. Kids can write down questions that other people came up with. So we get this big list. And then what I had them start doing, but then I had to truncate the time a little bit, we're actually going to be finishing it the week after, or the week of, that we're going to be posting this video. But they answered their own questions when I have them watch this documentary about the Iceman from Nova called Iceman Murder Mystery. There's a link to that down below as well if you're interested. It goes through like the whole history of the Iceman. It's like one of the earlier documentaries they did on him, so it still talks about at the time that they weren't quite sure like what happened to him, and they talk about this big murder mystery and what they did to go ahead and uncover that. There's also a newer one called Iceman Reborn, but it gets more into like them recreating and reconstructing like in, you know, a 3D image or like 3D printing of like the Iceman. So then we go ahead and I have them, again, I'm doing this in my later unit with my Mesopotamia unit, but you could go ahead and have them do a create a civilization project if you start emphasizing at this unit like what is incorporated in a civilization. I'm waiting on that because I think that fits better with Mesopotamia being the first civilization. But what I've done in the past and what I'm going to do in the future here, and we're going to have a resource actually that you can get from our Teachers Pay Teacher store with this, but the kids have the ability to go ahead and create a civilization. We go over the different aspects of civilization beforehand. So the geography, like where do you settle and build your civilization. We talk about government. It's like going off of like the GRAPES acronym. So like geography, the religion. We talk about like architecture, like the arts and achievements. We talk about politics, like the government. What kind of government do you have? Do you have a democracy, a republic? Do you have a tyranny? Do you have monarchy? Economics, so we get into like what goods are you producing, what services are you offering, and social structure, social hierarchy. There's several names you could give that, basically ranking the system of power. Who is more powerful than who, what roles do people play in society. And so we get into all of that, and they have to use those, the grapes, to create their own civilization. And recently, my past year, I had them do this in partners. They create a flag for their civilization. They can name their civilization. They can like produce whatever goods they want. You can even, I've had in years past, kids for differentiation take a step further. They had to write like their own like constitution, like their own specific laws for their civilization. If you're interested in that, there is a link down below to that. And there's also a link in our Teacher Pay Teacher store. And then just kick it off straightforward, give them a study guide, a couple days, answer the questions about the big, highlights we've talked about the unit. I like to do Kahoots. I love Kahoots. Kids seem to love Kahoots. To go ahead and do a review. And then we take the test. I'm all about trying to save time. Multiple choice, Google Forms, grades it all for me. And then I do have that essential question that I mentioned where the kids will, I'm having them write it out right now. Eventually, probably have them type it, but they can go ahead and answer their question in like a paragraph form. And that is something that I still have to go back through and grade and evaluate, but at least then I can give them the multiple choice section like pretty much right away, and they know exactly how they did, and it alleviates on impatience on that part from everybody. So that is maybe not a nutshell is my prehistory unit. If you are interested in the videos that we're creating here on Mr. and Mrs. Social Studies, please go ahead and hit subscribe. And please stay tuned if you were interested in this. We will also be doing a series for continuing the ancient world units. Next one will be Mesopotamia, probably coming out to you in the next few weeks or so. My wife, Sarah, she's also doing a series on U.S. history. So if you are a U.S. history teacher, please follow her series. It's really good, really fascinating. And I hope to see you guys next time. Bye.